All right, I'm going to give a little overview of the essay portion of the in-class midterm. Again, that is going to be taken in class. These essays should be written in class in a green book, ideally a large green book. And here we've got 2 full pages, is a kind of ballpark guesstimate or of how long I would expect kind of standardly written prose to take to answer these questions, right? So that's a estimate. People have bigger font, smaller font. Some people are loquacious. Some people are concise with their words. So all of that is just an approximation to the kind of length that you should expect to see. And really the most important take home there is that, so it's a fairly substantive essay. I'm looking for you to get into some details, spend your time developing some ideas, and you have enough space and time to do more than write a quick little blurb. So I think the most important thing going into this is that you see that, and so that you expect at some point that you'll be really getting into some kind of specific subtopic in some detail or some depth in your paper. So. Okay, I want to say a couple things really about a cluster of questions. That would be number 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, and 4. These all ask you to do roughly the same kind of thing, and that's to compare and contrast 2 religions, specifically with respect to some specific aspect of their worldview. If you remember the worldview model, or we call it, that Young introduced in chapter 1. There's something that we'll be using throughout. You can see each religion is presented, all the different worldview elements for that specific religion. So here I'm doing a kind of a classic comparative analysis kind of question, comparative religious analysis. And the main way to approach these is to think less in terms of getting it right or wrong, in terms of the comparison that you're making, but rather that we want to see fruitful rather than not fruitful comparisons. And the whole comparative analysis is fruitful and illuminating and shows us something, rather than it's correct or true, right? So the multiple choice part of the exam will have that more of that kind of approach to the information. It can be true or false, right or wrong. And of course, we can have better or worse, I should say more or less accurate descriptions of the religions in our analysis here. But really the fundamental thing that I'm asking you to do is to forge some links between 2 different religions. And really the hard part and the work, I think largely, is you finding and making those links, because they're not given to you, right? So in this essay, you have to go make those, and that gives you a lot of room to select and to choose. But it also means that it's not there for you to simply recapitulate. So let me do this. I'm going to say a couple things that would be suggested ways that you could go in this question. Say, for example, in the nature of the self, but really the same thing would go for the nature of reality, and I think to a large extent the question on the means of transformation. So let's say, for example, on number 1, and again this is like a model for this cluster of 3, it says here, compare and contrast Hinduism and Buddhism on the nature of the self, fairly broad. So there I would really just direct you to start at the humanity node, or the humanity element of the worldview for Hinduism. Go to the humanity element of the worldview for Buddhism, look at what's there, and you don't have to stay there. You don't have to stick with that. But that's, I think, the best place to start. And then start building your comparative account here out of that very specific part of the text, right? You might take it in different directions, but you know that you're starting in the right place. So what I'd like to comment on here mostly is the next part. Explain the relevant principles. And here, explain the relevant principles and what further differences you believe result from any differences in how they view the nature of the self. So what I'm asking here is, what other differences will there be between these religions, given that there's this fundamental difference about the nature of the self? It would be kind of odd if there wasn't some other way in which they differed, because they differ in this fundamental question of the self. For example, this is a suggestion, just a suggestion, we would expect there to be some difference in the means of transformation specified in the two religions if there's a fundamental difference in the nature of the self, right? So if we have a different competing views about what the self is, it's likely that we'd have competing views on how that self ultimately transforms in a religious sense, transforms itself. Now, it's possible that you might have disagreement at the metaphysical question about the nature of the self, but relative agreement in terms of the conception of transformation associated with those different views of the self, and that's fine. I think what we really want to see is just, how is it? That might be surprising in either direction, but really I just want you to be making a case as you go through that these are kind of shared views, these are divergent views, but that is one case where we would expect to see some other related difference in the nature of like the means and transformation when we see a difference in one worldview element. Most of these worldview elements are like, they're conceptually holistic in the sense that any change in one is going to bring about some change in the other. So the truth or falsity of one would affect the truth or falsity of others. They're connected like a conceptual web. So, we would expect differences to show up elsewhere when we see one clear difference in the nature of the self. So you could certainly, complete this question largely like that. Say, look, here's the views of the self, and I'm going to leave you to kind of work up whether these are shared or divergent views of the self. Let's look at how these different views of the self play out in other parts of the religion, in, for example, the means of transformation aspect. Do we see differences there that would parallel some of these differences in the self? So that's an example of the way you could go about finishing this question. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by, do you see any differences anywhere else in the religion because of this difference in the self? I think I asked that question for each of these three, and in each case, the suggestion would be to look at either one other element of the worldview that might differ, and this is really, really good, differences in the overall conception of human transformation in response to perceived ultimacy. I think that's a nice, fruitful way to go that we could do with the self. You can see also we can do that about the nature of reality. So for example, if we were to do that question, we'd go to the worldview elements, and you'd get to work and see if you see these as, a shared conception of ultimate reality or not, and you describe that there, really kind of basing that on the text. And now, again, we could ask, well, given, and here I'm on the number 2, just how we might go through this for number 2. Given that we see these competing conceptions of the nature of ultimate reality, it would be unsurprising if we also saw some differences in the nature of the self, since the self is a part of that ultimate reality, and they differ over that. So we would probably expect to see some differences in the specific nature of the self if we see those here in question 2. Also, another way that you can kind of pursue this, are there other differences? Part of the question is, here's these competing views of the nature of ultimate reality. Let's ask, how, if at all, do these differences show up in the overall sense of human transformation in response to perceived ultimacy that we can associate with that religion? It's another way in which you could spot some additional differences that emerge from the initial difference that you're looking at. So that's the common move here, right? You're going to do some kind of comparative work that really is pretty grounded in the text as it's presented, and now you're getting to work in looking at whether there's a shared or competing view of the phenomenon in question here. You'll make your case, right? So just make the case, have some supporting evidence. It's important. And then, we look at, well, it's kind of like setting this in context. Now let's like pull back a little bit, and we've done this close analysis on these two specific parts. Let's now look at how that affects the religion in a broader perspective. And that's what the rest of the essay is asking you to do there. So the only final thing is conclusion. And I'm not going to give you any specific direction on the conclusion. I wouldn't be grading the conclusion in the way that I would grade the rest of the essay itself. It's not really as important. But I think the most important thing to do here is to see which of these strikes you as the most plausible, or as we might just say, the most fruitful way of understanding things from the standpoint of the religious life. And you can make your case. Which of those two views that you looked at is more kind of fruitful, promising, spiritual conception, according to you, and you can state a little bit of why. Okay, so that's really for number 1, 2, and 4, which I really see as these kind of typical, almost stereotypical comparative analysis type questions. And in a way, they're kind of boring. It's like a compare and contrast. But I was just suggesting now, these are some good places to look towards in your essay, to link up with, to give it some richness, give it something interesting, and show the fruitfulness of your analysis. Because we can connect them to these other conceptual issues, and when we've got a disagreement, or even a small one, I think that's a good thing, really, rather than a bad thing. I mean, at least it can be, at least because as readers and thinkers, we now have something we need to figure out, right? There's a debate afoot, and we'll have to think it through. It's not obvious what the nature of the self is, or the nature of ultimate reality, or these things. So don't feel any particular need or pressure to show that there's alignment or agreement amongst the religions that you're looking at. Rather, I would suggest you really do look for where the differences lie. And I was trying to bring that out somewhat in the questions themselves, largely because I think, well, that's where maybe the more fruitful analysis and thinking through comes in. Whereas if people agree, then they agree. Isn't that great? But that's important too. So when we do see agreement, it's probably not trivial to see some alignment of views amongst the world's dominant religions. We might think, well, there's probably some there or there. Right? There's something to it if we do see alignment and agreement in some of these principles. So in your approach, it's good to get out both. Make sure you get out some kind of divergence and disagreement, right? Make sure that you can find some, and you want to give a nice balanced treatment in really what's there. You want to be having your analysis driven by just the actual content of the religious ideologies themselves. Okay, so let me comment on a couple of the others. Karma and freedom. This tends to be a fairly popular choice, but I want to say what I'm really expecting here is that you can present a version of the traditional philosophical problem of free will and determinism. Then you can show how karma arguably presents a version of that same problem, that we can't be both free and determined by karma. And then finally, this is a good share of the paper, is working your way to see if there's an account that can render those compatible, where you can explain how it can be true both that we really are determined by, or at least under the power of karma, otherwise it wouldn't have any importance. But we can nonetheless still be said to be acting freely of our own free choice and free will, and thus make sense of generating good karma or bad karma and all the rest of it. So I want to emphasize that I'm not going to say too much about this here, but do keep in mind what I'm looking for here is a fairly sophisticated, kind of clean philosophical type debate, where you want to really be able to frame the philosophical problem of free will and determinism in general, how karma gives us a version of that, and then you come in and see whether or not you can resolve them, whether you can make them consistent. And you can go either way. You can conclude that they are consistent, that they're not consistent. In class, we appealed to the concept of character as probably giving us the right psychological middle ground to recognize something that does have considerable force and power over us, that's related to our past actions, that we can be said to inherit, but also something that isn't so forceful that it's not acting like a law of nature or the law of gravity, where you couldn't ever act free of its force or escape its force. Sure you can. We can act out of character, we can change our character, we can modify our character, we can exert special kinds of interests and desires to counteract bad character traits and all that stuff. So we can still act freely, even though we're subject to the force of character. And in class, we've pursued whether or not that might give us a way to resolve this tension. And then there's interesting things that would follow when you kind of finish that up. So the last one I want to mention on here is the perspectives on gender and status of women. Again, this is a pretty generally stated prompt by design. And here you can compare and contrast any two religious perspectives that are in that chapter that we went over in chapter 18. They don't have to be religions we've already covered or even religions that we will cover. So this would potentially be a chance where you could kind of get into a religion that we're not going to. But I guess more importantly is to look and see where you can see an interesting philosophical debate or some kind of interesting rival or parallel or something like that. So here I'm really asking you mostly to explain one relevant difference and present an argument favoring one of these perspectives as a means of addressing, I should say, gender-based problems. And at the end here, so here I'm really, I guess we'll kind of pull back on that for a minute. Kind of like just a moral version of some of these earlier comparative analysis questions. But what we're comparing would be philosophical, moral positions on status of women and gender issues generally. So we want to be able to present some kind of rival or distinctive positions that we can associate with two of the different religions there. And here, asking you to do a similar kind of thing, really just make an argument for what you take to be. And it's important to give us your reasons here. Make an argument for what you take to be, I guess we might say, the morally more insightful, the morally preferable, or the morally better approach to issues of gender between the two that you are comparing. So that's a fairly standard kind of ethics argument. And we might boil it down to something like this. Which of the two seems to have a better, like, feminist philosophy or basis for moral principles that adequately respect the rights and interests of women between the two that we're looking at. And at the end, I think this is pretty interesting. This is a slightly different aspect of that. This is kind of a theoretical basis I was asking you to ground a preference with. On a practical level, I'm also asking you to reflect, how could that actually be implemented? Because there might be fine theoretical principles that just aren't as practical in terms of implementation as maybe not quite as stellar and perfect theoretical principles, but which would be workable and usable. So, and just to get to that aspect of the ethical side of this, we want to look at, what steps could we take to actually implement a good feminist ethic, or just a good ethic that adequately represents and protects the interests and rights of women. All right, so there I basically would just have you looking at that as like a moral debate question, and it just so happens that the positions being debated are taken from religions rather than some other source. So that would be about it. In terms of, I've got two here, Buddha and the Blues and Buddha in Sisyphus. I'll say a little something about that in class, or make some kind of separate thing for that. Those are kind of off on a different path. And I guess I would just say this. They all kind of deal with the nature, origin, and overcoming of suffering. Buddha, the Blues, and the myth of Sisyphus. So I'm kind of looking for you to do something comparative there. Look at these different perspectives on the origin, nature, and overcoming suffering from Buddha, the Blues, in something like the way that I was asking you to do these other ones. I would say this, we didn't have a lot of time to go over the Blues itself. If you want to do this, on Buddha and the Blues, it's actually a great question. There's a lot of really cool, interesting stuff there. But I would say you should be willing and ready to to spend a little time researching the Blues, and you can look through some of the resources I've put up or on your own, or that you've already done so. You've already got a pretty good working knowledge of maybe jazz and blues, and you've got a basis that you can bring along here. So if you don't, and you couldn't see yourself doing much new research on the blues for the question, maybe you should pass. So I wouldn't think this is not for everybody, since we didn't really cover these in class, but they're there. And I like to have a couple questions that are a little more creative, a little more far afield, and they're all there as possibilities. So the exam, you'll get all of these, and you'll just have to choose one. You can choose the one now, today, tomorrow, yesterday, and it will be there. So I would suggest writing it out, 2-3 times. Practice it, write it out 2-3 times, and make sure you come to class with a clean, empty green book rather. Don't show up with it already written, and we'll make sure that doesn't happen. There's likely to be a little opportunity for you to jot down an outline that you might use, but you'll have to do that like on the spot. Don't bring anything with you that you're going to use in the writing of the exam itself. Just you and the paper. There might be a little bit of time beforehand to do something. Alrighty, so I hope that's somewhat useful. I wanted to give you mostly kind of like broad, strategic approach kind of things. In terms of the nuts and bolts, really the information is just by default is going to be, as told from our young chapter. And from there, it's about you going to work with some comparative analysis of the information that he's got there. And maybe as a broad take-home point, I really want to see you somewhere pretty clearly in the paper, and that it's not just like an information dump. Information is good, fine, but I really want to make sure that I can see at some point you really kind of took over the narrative here with your own original comparative analysis of the material from the book. That's maybe the most important take-home point. Alrighty, so that'll do it.